The Australian-made and 100% owned Ozzie Multi-Jig is at the forefront of technology for joining timber with dowels. Invented by Sydney carpenter joiner Des Fenelon, the jig is on display in the Great Inventions section of the Sydney Powerhouse Museum, the Museum of Applied Arts and Science. The Australian Woodworker magazine said that the Ozzie Multi-Jig has the 4 most important features for a dowel jig: simplicity, accuracy, versatility and durability. With the Ozzie Multi-Jig, there's no measuring or marking of holes. Timber is cut exactly to length before it's joined. Requires no special skills to operate. When you buy the Ozzie Multi-Jig, you'll find it consists of 5 parts. There are 2 mirror image guide blocks made from case hardened steel. Each guide block has 6 6mm and 6 8mm guide holes and 2 connecting holes, a centre spacer plate and an end stop spacer. The end stop is used as a spacer when doing edge-to-edge joints. There is also a threaded cramping strip with 3 threaded holes that permit the jig to be assembled into a number of configurations using the socket head screws and the Allen keys supplied. The jig can join timber from 10mm to any thickness by using the spacers. To adjust the jig, the spacers are inserted between the spacer plate and the guide blocks. The washers and nuts supplied in the kit are used as spacers to adjust the guide blocks to allow for timber of different thicknesses. Simply disassemble the jig. Slide the screws through the guide block. Place the spacer nut on the screw. Assemble the spacer plate. Spacer nuts on the screws and the other guide block. Assemble the jig. It's now been adjusted for thicker timber. The 5-piece Ozzie Multi-Jig can be assembled in many different configurations. The jig can be used to join timber from 10mm to any thickness. Can be used for practically any timber joint. And durability, it's made from case hardened steel. The Ozzie Multi-Jig can be used to drill holes for practically any kind of dowel joint. Edge to edge. Rail to post joints with a single row of dowels. Or rail to post joints with a double row of dowels. End-to-end butt joints, T-butt joints, T-butt joints in sheet material, a box corner for the joints of drawers, 45-degree miter joints, rail to stile joints, and angled joints for louvered doors and vents. Such versatility. To make a frame using miter joints, first cut the timber to size so the opposite sides are exactly the same length as each other. Then lay the 4 pieces of timber on a flat surface and check that all 4 miters fit perfectly. Always mark the face side of the timber on each piece. Clamp the timber to be drilled face sides against the centre plate and up to the end stop. This is essential for accurate drilling. Place a depth stop on the drill to avoid drilling right through the timber. Just a simple block of wood with a hole drilled through it. When drilling the timber, make sure the timber is firmly clamped so it does not move. Drill holes as the width allows. To assemble the frame, first make up the two halves. Then join the two halves across their diagonals using no more than push strength. While these dowels make strong joints, they must always be glued. To make a frame with flush butt joints and T-butt joints, first cut all the timber to the exact length, with the stiles the same length and the rails exactly the same length as each other. This is very important. Next, mark the face side and one edge of each piece of timber. Failure to mark the face sides and reference edges of all of the pieces will cause problems when using the jig later on. To join the bottom rail, make sure that the face side is against the spacer plate and the face edge against the stop block. Put a depth stop on the drill so that the holes are drilled the right length. After you have drilled one end of the rail, place the other end on the other side of the jig, face side against the spacer, face edge against the end stop. Drill the holes. Depending on the size of the timber, it may be possible to clamp two rails in the jig at the same time. Make sure that the marked face is against the centre plate and the marked edge is up against the end stop. These face marks are the secret of using the Ozzie jig. Follow the same process. Reverse the rails so that the face sides are still against the centre plate and the face edges are against the end stop. So much for the rails. To drill the stiles, place the timber side by side with the marked edges uppermost and faces face to face. Line up the stiles on the end with a block of wood or a square to make sure they're perfectly flush. Mark the position of the cross rails for the T-butt joint. Remove the end stop from the Ozzie multi-jig and then insert the jig with the spacer plate between the two stiles. Line up the end of the jig to the pencil marks for the T-butt joint. Clamp the jig in place. Now drill the two stiles in one operation. To drill the stiles for the end rails, make sure the timber and the Ozzie multi-jig are all lined up flush. Then clamp the jig and drill the holes. The wide bottom rail, then the narrow top rail. up flush, clamp tight, drill the holes. While there's no glue being used here in the assembly, it's essential that joints of this type are always glued. Don't only apply the glue to the dowels, but also apply glue to all of the mating faces. Tap the dowels in position, first in one style and then in the other. The depth stop on the drill has guaranteed that the dowel holes are the correct depth. A spot of glue in each dowel hole, a smear of glue on each mating face. The Ozzie Jig guarantees absolute accuracy, face sides to face sides, face side to face side. And now the wide bottom rail. You can see how important the face side markings have become. Then with glue applied, tap the joints up firm. Absolutely flush in every way. Check the diagonals of the frame to ensure squareness. And then check that it's sitting flat on the bench and that the frame is not twisted. Another perfect frame from the Ozzie multi-jig. Rail to post joints. This type of joint is the same as rail to stile, except that after you've drilled the post, spacer blocks are inserted to position the rails for drilling. This is to offset the rail from the face of the post. Begin by marking the face side on the rails and the post. Carefully position the Ozzie multi-jig on the face of the legs. Clamp firmly in position. Fit the depth stop so the 8mm dowels are drilled to the right depth. Having drilled both posts, it's now time to drill both ends of the rail. Remove the screws. Take the guide blocks and reverse them so that the 8mm holes are now on the inside of the jig. Tighten the screws firmly. Place the face side in position against the spacer plate of the jig. A piece of timber on the outside to protect the timber against the foot of the cramp. The face edge level with the end of the jig. Turn the timber over so the face side is once again against the spacer plate. Flush to the end of the jig, cramped in place, drill the holes. Insert the dowels in the holes in the posts. Always glue the dowels in place and apply glue as a light film on all the mating faces. The dowels by themselves are not sufficient for permanent joining. The accuracy of the Ozzie multi-jig is such that even this many holes match up perfectly. And the other side. Not only are the joints perfect, but the frame is flat. When joining timber of 35mm or thicker, 2 rows of 8mm dowels can be used. First, assemble the Ozzie multi-jig with guide blocks hard against each other and the spacer plate on one side, so the Ozzie multi-jig is now L-shaped. Prepare the rails and posts to length, ready for the construction. Mark the face side and one edge of the rails, and of course mark one face and one edge of the post. Depending upon the thickness of the rails, it may be necessary to place a shim, a piece of plywood or masonite or solid timber, between the rail and the spacer plate so that the rail is exactly in the centre of the jig. To drill the holes, clamp the timber in the jig with the marked face against the spacer plate and the marked face edge flush with the end of the jig. Drill the double row of holes for the dowels in the end of the rail. To drill the post, clamp the jig without the shim flush with the end of the post. Cramp in position. Drill the holes. The depth stop on the drill guarantees the correct length of drilling. Apply a spot of glue to each of the holes and insert the dowels into the post. Only the Ozzie multi-jig will guarantee the level of accuracy for this kind of joint. Apply glue into the holes and onto the end grain of the rail. Assemble with the marked edge flush to the end a perfect fit and flush to the end. A tribute to the accuracy of the Ozzie multi-jig. With the Ozzie multi-jig, making drawers is now simple. The first one is a double-fronted drawer to conceal metal runners. The corner joint will have blind holes. First, cut the front, sides and back to length. Put a groove in the front and sides to accept the sliding drawer bottom. Mark the width of the back so it finishes 5 millimetres down from the top edges and sides. Mark the face side of the back. It's easy to see the inside of the drawer because the groove is in place. Clamp the sides flat on the bench with the ends overhanging. Grooves adjacent to each other. Put a depth stop on the drill to avoid drilling right through the timber. Use spacer washers for fine adjustment. Make sure that the holes do not meet the groove. Drill the first hole. Having drilled the first hole, insert a dowel through the jig in the timber to hold the jig in position. The dowel will ensure that the Ozzie multi-jig does not move when you drill the rest of the holes. Repeat the operation on the other side. Use a dowel to locate the jig. Drill the remainder of the holes. To drill the holes in the end of the front, first clamp the front of the Ozzie multi-jig with the outer face against the centre plate. Drill the holes with the outer face of the drawer against the guide plate. Next, drill the holes in the back rail of the drawer with the face mark hard against the spacer plate and the face edge flush with the outer end with the face mark against the spacer plate and the face edge flush with the outer edge of the jig. The next step is to drill the sides of the back rail. First, the jig has been taken apart to rotate the guide blocks so the 6mm holes are now the furthest from the spacer plate, so that the back rail will be set in from the end of the sides to make room for glue blocks for extra strength. Clamp the sides to the bench with the back edge overhanging about 100 millimeters to make room for the jig. Position the jig with the end of the guide blocks in line with the top of the groove. This is achieved by placing a piece of plywood the same thickness as the drawer bottom in the groove. Push the jig up hard against the piece of plywood. Put a depth stop in place and drill the holes. Lock the jig in place. Complete the drilling. Repeat the process now on the other side. A piece of plywood in the groove to locate the jig. Drill the holes. The depth stop length will vary from operation to operation. Glue and insert the dowels in the drawer sides first. While no glue is used in any part of these demonstrations, dowel joints must always be glued. They do not have sufficient structural strength. First, glue the dowel in the hole. Then, apply glue to all of the matching faces. Face side, properly orientated. The back. The front. Complete the assembly. Drill 2 holes to attach the screws for fixing the blind drawer front. Slide the drawer bottom in position. Orientate the double front and screw into position. Absolute accuracy guaranteed. The next type of corner joint makes a feature of the dowels, similar to a dovetail, only faster. First, rebate the front of the drawer to the thickness of the sides. Leave about 2 millimeters to the face of the rebate. Next, join the back rail to the 2 sides with blind holes as in the previous demonstration. Now put this aside. Next, assemble the Ozzie multi-jig with only 1 guide block using the 50mm socket head screws, and adjust the guide block with spacers so the 6mm holes are in the centre of the rebate. Stand the drawer on its side and place the front in position. Place the jig with the guide block onto the side of the drawer and the spacer plate against the front face of the drawer. Then place a clamp from the back edge of the side onto the front of the spacer plate to hold it securely into position. Make sure the front and side are aligned with each other. Tighten the clamp. Now drill through the face of the side, down, right down onto the edge of the front. Then take the clamp away. Turn the drawer over and repeat the process on the other side. Remove the jig and clean all the sawdust out from in between the mating faces. Apply glue to the faces, then glue the dowels into the holes. Leave the dowels protruding about 1/2 millimetre above the face of the drawer side. Insert the drawer bottom and check the drawer for squareness across its diagonals. Apply the clamps, check the diagonals again, put to one side to dry. When dry, it's a simple matter to sand the dowels flush with the surface. Incredibly strong, perfectly accurate, the Ozzie multi-jig makes another successful drawer. The simplest of all joints is edge to edge. However, the dowels have nothing to do with the strength of the joint. All the dowels do is align the boards while the glue is setting. If the edges of the boards were perfectly square and straight, all that would be needed is glue. However, using dowels when joining several boards makes the job much easier. To join boards edge to edge using the Ozzie multi-jig, first detach the end stop from the multi-jig. Place the boards side by side with marked edges uppermost and the marked faces in towards each other. That detached end stop is now inserted between the boards as a spacer, and the boards are then clamped together. This stops any movement as the dowel holes are drilled. Insert the Ozzie multi-jig with the spacer plate between the pieces of timber. If necessary, the multi-jig can be clamped in place when using 8mm dowels, but in this demonstration 6mm dowels are being used, and it's enough just to hold the board by hand as the holes are drilled. The spacing of the holes will depend upon how thick and straight the timber is. For timber 12mm thick, space the holes at about 200mm, and for thicker timber about 300mm apart. After you've drilled all the holes, insert the glue and the dowels and clamp the boards together. Don't forget, apply glue to all of the matching faces. Glue is not being used in these demonstrations because of the time that it would take to apply. Absolutely perfectly flush. Place a straight edge across the face of the boards to check that they are perfectly flat. Apply clamps to both sides to ensure that the joint is firmly bonded. Perfectly flush. Building a carcass with sheet material is a simple matter using the Ozzie multi-jig. To drill a line of holes in a sheet of plywood or chipboard, assemble the Ozzie multi-jig with the guide blocks end to end, using the socket-headed screws. For this assembly, first put 8mm of spacers onto the socket head screws. This is to stop the screws from protruding through the threaded clamping strip. Clamp a straight edge across the sheet of the material to hold the jig with the threaded clamping strip side against the straight edge. Clamp the straight edge in position. Drill one hole. Insert a dowel through the jig into the timber. The jig was held in position by the dowel. Drill the remaining holes. Then, using a dowel to relocate the jig, move the jig along the straight edge. To drill the matching piece, first put a spacer block beside the spacer plate so that the holes to be drilled are in the centre of the thickness of the material. Now drill one hole. Place the dowel in position. Move the jig along. Locate with the dowel and drilling once again every second hole, drill the remainder of the hole. Glue the dowels in position. Apply a film of glue to the edge of the board being fixed. Then locate the two pieces of carcass together. Once again, the accuracy of the Ozzie multi-jig will guarantee a perfect joint. For making louvers or vent doors, first assemble the jig into a V shape using the 50mm socket head screws. Place oversized nuts or washers on the screws. Connect the guide blocks to the spacer plate by inserting the screws through the spacer plate and into the 6mm guide holes in the guide blocks. To set the angle of the guide blocks, first make two spacer blocks the same length as the spacer plate. Place the spacer blocks between the two stiles, one each end, then clamp them together. To make a spacer guide, drill a 6mm hole 9mm in from the edge of a piece of batten. Then drill a second hole using the jig as a guide. Insert a dowel in each end of the spacer guide. Next, Place the jig in position with the spacer plate between the two stiles. Using an offcut of one of the slats, insert it into the jig, set the guide blocks at the required angle and tighten up the screws. To ensure that the jig does not move once the angles are set, fix a piece of 12mm ply or batten up against the threaded clamping strip and across the two guide blocks using 8mm dowels. To prevent drilling the wrong holes, insert dowels in the holes not being used or cover them up with tape. This can avoid a very costly mistake. Position the first slat with the width of the rail plus 20mm from the end of the stile. After you've drilled for the first slat, insert the spacer guide. Now insert the spacer guide. Now hold the jig against the spacer guide and repeat the process for each slat. And so on all the way down the stiles. To locate the position of the rails, place the top and bottom slats in the stiles. The rails should have a groove in them so that the slats sit in about 3mm. Hold the rail in position with the slat in the groove and mark the stile. The rails and stiles are now ready to be drilled to create the frame. Having drilled the rails and stiles, as was seen in an earlier demonstration, now insert the dowels in the stiles, glue in the dowels as you go. When inserting the dowels in the slats, on one end of the slat leave one dowel protruding 5mm more than the rest. This will make it much easier to assemble. Assemble all the slats into the holes. Having inserted all the slats, now assemble the rails and the opposite stile. Absolutely perfect. Once again, the accuracy of the jig made a very difficult task quite simple. If you require any further information, don't hesitate to contact Des Fenelon at any time at Ozzie Jigs.